Imagine a world where the wine in your glass isn't just delicious, but maybe even uh, leading the charge against climate change.
It sounds a bit surprising, doesn't it?
It does. Did you know the global vitivinicultural sector, that's basically everything from grapes on the vine to wine in your cellar, it's this huge economic engine, right?
Absolutely massive.
But it also carries a pretty significant environmental footprint. And, well, they're grappling directly with the urgency of climate change, and they're taking some incredibly serious scientific steps to deal with it.
That's right. It's becoming a major focus.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into how this sector is tackling that challenge, specifically through what's called rigorous greenhouse gas, or GHG, accounting.
Yeah, getting down to the nuts and bolts of their emissions.
Exactly. And our guide for this is quite something. It's a brand new document, Volume 1 of the Methodological Recommendations for GHG Balance Accounting in the Vitivinicultural Sector, just out from the International Organization of Vine and Wine, the OIV, in July 2025.
The OIV is really central here, aren't they? Guiding the whole vine and wine world through these, well, tricky climate issues.
Definitely. So our mission for you, our listeners, is kind of give you that shortcut, to really understand this complex world of carbon footprinting in wine, and maybe uncover some surprising facts along the way.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's unpack this whole thing. We all know climate change is a massive global challenge. That's a given. But what does it mean specifically for grapes and wine? These seem like really climate-sensitive crops.
Oh, incredibly sensitive.
And how does agriculture just generally fit into this global emissions puzzle?
Well, it's fascinating, actually, how tightly linked the wine sector is to climate change. It's being hit hard by it, but it's also, a contributor itself.
Right.
The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've stated very clearly that human influence has warmed the planet. We're seeing these rapid, widespread changes.
No doubt about that.
And while the Paris Agreement aims to keep that global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally aiming for 1.5 degrees, well, we've already caused about 1.1 degrees of warming.
Which is already significant, isn't it?
It really is. And agriculture is right there on the front lines. The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, they pointed out back in 2022 how severely farming is already being affected.
How so specifically?
We're seeing rising temperatures, of course, but also really unpredictable rain patterns, more droughts, more extreme weather, even land getting saltier near coasts.
Wow.
And for vineyards, this translates directly into shifts in what they call phenology, basically the timing of everything, like when buds burst or grapes ripen. Higher temperatures are messing with that schedule.
Okay.
It also affects how the vines manage water. It can cut down productivity, and it can even lead to more pests and diseases showing up.
So the actual places you can successfully grow certain grapes, those are changing.
They are literally changing, yeah. The traditional boundaries are shifting.
And the contribution part. How does agriculture add to the problem?
Right. So it's not just a victim. The whole agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, AFOLU they call it, was responsible for somewhere between 13 and 21% of global human-caused GHG emissions just in the decade from 2010 to 2019.
The big chunk.
It is. And it mainly comes from things like deforestation, big fires, livestock, obviously, and how soils and fertilizers are managed. So the wine chain, just like any other crop system, is deeply tied into these environmental conditions, which makes its own contribution really important to tackle.
Okay, but here's where, for me, it gets really interesting. Despite all these challenges, the OIV document actually suggests the wine sector could play a leading role in mitigation.
Yeah, that's a key point.
That feels pretty remarkable. Like, wine isn't just part of the solution, but maybe even a template for other farming sectors. Why? What puts them in that position?
Well, the findings seem to indicate that wine production, especially when it's, actively following sustainable practices, it generally has a lower contribution to global warming compared to quite a few other agri-food products.
Oh.
So that puts it in a kind of unique spot to demonstrate effective climate action that could potentially be scaled up.
So if they're aiming to lead, where are the biggest environmental hotspots they've identified within their own chain? From grape to glass, where are the main impacts?
Okay, so primarily you've got the agricultural phase itself right there in the vineyard. Think pesticides, fertilizers, that kind of input.
Right, the farming part.
Exactly. Then once the grapes leave the field, in the processing phase, packaging is a huge one. Really huge. Especially glass bottles, but also, corks, screw caps, cardboard boxes, all that stuff adds up.
I always suspected the bottle was a big part of it.
It often is, yeah. And then there's distribution, getting the wine to us. Its impact can vary a lot, obviously, depending on how far it travels and how efficient the transport is.
Makes sense. So with all these impacts and this potential for leadership, why this intense focus now on GHG balance accounting? What does going through that whole detailed process actually do for a winery or a vineyard?
Well, GHG balance accounting, it's essentially a really focused management tool. It lets an organization properly understand, identify, evaluate, and then quantify all the significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And also removals, like carbon stored in soils or vines across their whole value chain, or maybe just for one specific product.
So it's about getting a really clear picture, like
Yeah.
an X-ray of their climate impact.
Exactly, a very detailed X-ray. And the benefits are, well, there are quite a few. First off, it creates that baseline data. You can't improve what you don't measure, right?
True.
So this baseline is absolutely essential for spotting where you can actually cut emissions. It's like it gives you a roadmap for reducing your carbon footprint.
Okay, a roadmap. I like
Okay.
that.
Second, it lets you report your performance transparently to, stakeholders, customers. And that's becoming a really critical management issue these days for your reputation, for trust.
Right, people are asking these questions more and more.
They are. And beyond that, it helps businesses deal with external pressures. Things like potential trade barriers based on carbon footprint, or new regulations demanding decarbonization, or even just supply chains wanting more climate due diligence.
So it's about risk management, too.
Definitely. And of course, how a company acts on climate really shapes its image. If you genuinely understand your emissions profile, you can set realistic, science-based targets for reduction. You can build a proper climate action plan with, defined actions, resources, timelines.
Like you might find out something specific.
Yeah, exactly. For instance, we've seen wineries track their Scope 1 emissions, their direct fuel use, say, and discover that just by tweaking how they run their vineyard tractors, maybe optimizing routes or something, they could cut fuel use by 15%.
Wow, 15%.
Yeah. And that means direct cost savings and less carbon. It's a win-win they probably wouldn't have spotted without doing the detailed accounting.
That makes perfect sense.
And look, this isn't some brand new idea for the OIV either. They've actually been working on this stuff since around 2010.
Oh, really? That far back?
Yep, developing an international protocol for the accounting of greenhouse gas emissions in grape and wine production. The whole goal was, and still is, to give clear, consistent methods so companies can do a complete assessment of their emissions.
So standardizing the approach.
Precisely. Helping organizations choose the right methodology, making it simpler and maybe cheaper by having standards, giving them the info they need for smart GHG management strategies, and just making the reporting more consistent and transparent for everyone.
And it's not just CO2 they're tracking.
Oh, no, definitely not. They look at the 6 main internationally recognized GHGs. So yeah, carbon dioxide, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and then some potent industrial gases like SF6, HFCs, PFCs. If they're relevant to the operation, it's meant to be comprehensive.
Okay, comprehensive. So if I'm running a winery, or maybe a vineyard, how do I even start measuring all this? It sounds daunting. Does the OIV give a clear path?
They do provide a very structured path, yeah. But the absolute first step, before you even think about collecting data, is that the organization has to clearly define its objective.
The objective, meaning?
Meaning, you got to ask, why are we actually doing this accounting? What do we want to achieve with it? Is the main goal marketing? Or is it about improving our product's footprint? Or maybe we need it for regulatory reporting.
Ah, okay. So the why dictates the how.
Exactly. Getting that clarity up front guides the whole process and stops you wasting time and effort collecting data you don't actually need for your goal.
Makes sense. So once the objective is clear, what are the main ways the OIV suggests approaching this? You mentioned 2 earlier.
That's right. 2 major approaches. First, there's what they call the organizational protocol. You might also hear it called the enterprise protocol.
Okay, organizational, what's that about?
Its purpose is to give guidelines on figuring out the total amount of an organization's emissions and removals over a specific time period, usually a year. It's about understanding the entire company's overall GHG profile.
The whole business footprint.
Precisely. And the idea is that this understanding helps you build a comprehensive climate action strategy for the whole operation. Now, when you define the boundaries for this, the most common way, and often the most complete, is to look at all the emissions from assets that are under your operational control.
Operational control, so stuff you directly manage.
Exactly. And within that organizational boundary, emissions get classified into these things called scopes. You've probably heard of them. Scope 1, 2, and 3.
Vaguely, yeah. Can you break those down?
Sure. So Scope 1 is your direct emissions. Stuff coming from sources the organization owns or controls directly. Think fuel burn in vineyard tractors, maybe leaks from your own refrigeration units, or emissions from specific chemical processes you run on site.
Yeah, direct stuff. Got it.
Then Scope 2 covers indirect emissions, but specifically from purchased energy. So the emissions generated off-site to produce the electricity, heat, or steam that your winery buys and uses.
Right, the power plant emissions linked to my usage.
You got it. And then there's Scope 3. This is the big one, often. It includes basically all other indirect emissions that aren't in Scope 2. These happen in your value chain, both upstream and downstream, where you have varying levels of influence, but you don't directly control the source.
Like what, for example?
Oh, lots of things. Purchase goods and services, so the grapes you buy from growers if you don't grow them all yourself. Packaging materials you purchase, fertilizers, also transportation and distribution of your products, waste generated in your operations but treated elsewhere, employee commuting, business travel.
Wow, that sounds like it could be huge.
It often is, especially in the wine sector with things like grapes and packaging. And it's really crucial to note that under the latest international standards, like ISO 14064, reporting Scope 3 is generally no longer optional if you're doing a comprehensive inventory. It has to be included.
So you can't just ignore it anymore?
Nope. And with this organizational approach, it's also really important to track these emissions over time. You'd ideally recalculate previous year's emissions if you have big structural changes, like buying another vineyard, or if you get better data, or if the accounting protocols themselves get updated. That's the only way to really see if your climate actions are actually working.
Okay, that's the organizational protocol. What's the second approach?
The second one is the product protocol. This one guides the accounting for emissions and removals linked to individual goods, like specifically 1 kilogram of grapes or one 750 milliliter bottle of wine.
So zooming in on a single product.
Exactly. It looks at the product through its entire life cycle. The aim here is to really understand that specific product's full environmental footprint and find opportunities to reduce its emissions.
Okay, and you mentioned a functional unit. What's that?
Right. The functional unit, or FU, is absolutely critical for the product protocol. It's basically the reference unit you're analyzing. It defines exactly what you're measuring the footprint of.
So,
Well, the OIV gives examples like 750 milliliters of wine in its container, or 1 kilogram of fresh grapes. But the more specific you can be, the better and more comparable the result is.
could you give a really specific example?
Sure. A really detailed FU might be something like 750 milliliters of reserve Cabernet Sauvignon red wine from the 2018 vintage, packaged in a standard 500-gram green glass bottle with a natural cork closure and aluminum capsule, destined for the on-trade market in Sweden.
Wow, okay, that is specific, down to the market and the bottle weight.
Yep. That level of detail makes the calculation much more precise and meaningful. And then, for these final products, the system boundaries, what stages you include, typically cover cradle to grave.
Cradle to grave, meaning
Meaning you look at everything, from the raw materials extracted to grow the grapes, the cradle, all the way through production, distribution, consumer use, and finally the end-of-life disposal or recycling of the packaging the grapes.
the whole life cycle.
The whole thing. You sometimes hear about cradle-to-gate analysis, too. That usually stops when the product leaves the winery gate, so it focuses more on the producer's direct impact, excluding distribution, retail, and end-of-life.
So cradle to gate is like a subset of cradle to grave.
Essentially, yes. Cradle to grave gives the full picture for the final consumer product.
Right. It's fascinating how these two protocols serve different but, equally vital purposes. One's looking at the whole company, the other's drilling down into one specific bottle. So that makes me wonder, why would a winery choose one over the other? Or maybe use both? Is it about the story they want to tell, or maybe what kind of impact they're trying to measure?
That's exactly it. It really comes down to their objective, back to that first step. An organization might lean towards the organizational protocol if their main goal is showing overall corporate responsibility, Or maybe setting company-wide reduction targets, or perhaps they need to comply with regulations that require reporting on their whole enterprise footprint.
So strategic planning for the whole business.
Right. The product protocol, on the other hand, is perfect if they want to, say, improve the environmental performance of a specific wine they make, or maybe differentiate that product in the marketplace as being lower carbon, or meet specific demands from retailers or consumers who are asking for that product level footprint info.
Ah, so more for marketing or product development.
Often, yes. But many, I'd say, progressive companies actually end up using both protocols.
Really? Why both?
Because they give you different lenses on the same issue.
Okay.
You get the holistic view from the organizational level, which informs broad strategy, and you get the granular detail at the product level, which allows for specific optimizations and communication. They really complement each other perfectly.
That's incredibly insightful. Okay, so given the sheer complexity here, tracking everything from, I don't know, fertilizer use years ago to the exact type of cork in the bottle, how do organizations actually do this accounting in practice? It sounds unbelievably detailed to turn all these activities into, meaningful GHG numbers.
Well, yeah, you're right. Directly measuring the actual greenhouse gas coming off every single source isn't usually practical or even possible for most things.
So how do they estimate it then?
Generally, the emissions are estimated, and the basic calculation is multiplying something called activity data by an emission factor.
Okay, activity data and emission factor. Break that down.
Sure. Activity data is just a measure of how much of something you did or used. So liters of diesel fuel your tractors burn, or kilograms of glass bottles you bought, or kilowatt hours of electricity you consumed. It's the how much part.
Right, the quantity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then the emission factor is a coefficient. It represents how much greenhouse gas is released per unit of that activity. So kilograms of CO2 equivalent per liter of diesel, or per kilogram of glass produced, or per kilowatt hour of electricity generated in your specific region.
Ah, so it's like the emissions rate for that activity.
Precisely. You multiply the how much activity data by the emissions rate, emission factor, and that gives you your estimated total emissions for that specific activity.
And getting those factors right must be key.
Absolutely crucial. You need emission factors that are as specific as possible to your situation, your location, your technology, and they need to be up to date and come from reliable sources for the calculation to be accurate.
Where do they get this data? The activity data and the factors?
Well, data quality is really paramount here. You've got primary data, which is stuff you collect directly from your own process, like reading your fuel logs or your electricity bills. That's usually the best if you can get it.
Okay.
Then there's secondary data, which comes from external sources like scientific literature or, more commonly, specialized databases. These databases compile average emission factors for common materials, energy sources, transport methods, that sort of thing.
So you might use a mix.
Exactly. Getting perfect, exact values for absolutely everything can be really difficult and costly. So the goal is usually a continuous improvement. You'd probably use a combination of methods, get good primary data for your biggest emission sources where you have control, and then use reliable secondary data from recognized databases for maybe the smaller stuff or things further up your supply chain where primary data is hard to get.
And there are databases specifically for this.
Oh yes, several key ones. Internationally, you have factors published by the IPCC itself. Then there are well-regarded national or regional databases like Agribalize in France, or EcoInvent, which is Swiss-based but widely used, though it's often subscription-based. The GHG protocol also recommends certain databases, and there's a network called GLD, the Global LCA Data Access Network, trying to improve access.
Okay. And what about actually doing the math? Do they use special software?
They can. I mean, manual calculation using spreadsheets is perfectly possible, especially for smaller organizations or simpler footprints. But yeah, external tools, whether complex spreadsheets or dedicated software, definitely simplify the process, especially when you're dealing with lots of different emission sources and factors.
Are there tools just for wine?
There are, actually. Several have been developed specifically for the vitivinicultural sector, which is
Yeah.
pretty cool. Things like the Australian Wine Carbon Calculator, one in Austria too. The Confronting Climate Change Initiative has tools. The International Wine Carbon Calculator Protocol, IWCA calculators. These are designed to help wineries streamline these quite complex calculations using relevant data for their industry.
Right. So once they've crunched all the numbers,
Yeah.
using these tools and data,
Yeah,
interpreting the results and reporting them must be the next big step.
absolutely. The numbers themselves only tell part of the story.
So all this measurement, all this data collection, what does it actually lead to? How do these wineries and vineyards use this information to make a real difference on the ground?
Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? moving from just understanding your impact to actually doing something about it. This detailed GHG accounting directly enables organizations to set realistic goals for reducing emissions and maybe even increasing carbon sequestration, like in their soils.
Goals based on actual data, not just guesswork.
Exactly. Scientifically based goals. The accounting becomes this really appropriate management tool for tracking your progress towards decarbonization over time. It helps you define the specific actions you need to take, figure out the resources you need, and set clear timelines for getting it done.
So it turns the raw data into a concrete action plan.
Precisely. It transforms that data into a clear roadmap for becoming more sustainable. For example, if the accounting clearly shows that, say, the weight of their glass bottles is a massive chunk of their product's footprint.
Which it often is, you said.
Right. Then the winery can use that specific finding to actively search for lighter glass options, or maybe explore alternative packaging like boxes or cans for certain wines, or work with their supplier on recycled content. Without the detailed accounting, that clear path to effective action just wouldn't be as visible. They might be focusing their efforts elsewhere less effectively.
So it really directs the effort where it matters most.
That's the idea, focus and efficiency in climate action.
And there you have it. That was quite a deep dive into how the vitivinicultural sector is, well, pretty proactively addressing climate change through this sophisticated GHG accounting.
It really is a significant effort.
Yeah, it feels like a clear pathway they're building towards a more sustainable future for the wines and grapes we all enjoy. And it seems built on, rigorous data and what sounds like a real commitment to environmental responsibility.
I think that's fair to say, yes.
And understanding these methods, even just scratching the surface like we've done, I think it really helps you appreciate the huge amount of effort that might be behind that sustainable bottle of wine or a bunch of grapes you pick up.
It certainly gives you a new perspective.
It really does. Which brings up maybe a final thought. If we can get this meticulous, this detailed, about measuring the carbon footprint of a single bottle of wine, what other industries, maybe ones we don't immediately think of as having a huge impact, should be next in line to adopt this kind of detailed accountability?
That's a great question.
And, how might that wider adoption accelerate global climate action overall? What really stands out to you from this whole deep dive we've just done?